The Rational Ruminations piece really spotlights
Relativism, reliabilism, and absolutism.
exactly.
And getting a handle on these different viewpoints.
Okay, so given all those principles and goals of SE,
If you look at its core concerns and methods, it resonates most strongly with
what are some concrete, actionable ways to maybe tweak or strengthen the practice of SE? Okay, let's dive in then, starting with relativism. So the basic gist here is that truth isn't like a fixed point on a map. It kind of shifts depending on your perspective, maybe your culture, the situation. It's that whole true for you, but maybe not true for me idea.
That's the heart of it, yeah. Relativism suggests that while even the rules we use to judge what's true or false,
Yeah.
they're shaped by our specific context. And they're really only authoritative within that bubble, so to speak. A key part of this is the claim that there's no, neutral ground. No objective spot we can all stand on to judge everyone's truth claims in a way that works for all people, all the time.
So what's the upside of looking at things that way? What's the strength?
Well, a big plus for relativism is how it really forces you to consider context. It pushes for, understanding and being open to different views.
Right, because people's beliefs don't just pop out of nowhere.
Exactly. They often come from really deep cultural roots or personal stuff. And thinking relativistically can definitely make us maybe less rigid in our own heads, help build bridges sometimes. It also highlights how our beliefs and our situations kind of feed off each other. And some people argue it's just the best fit for a world like ours, pluralistic, lots of different ways of thinking.
That makes a lot of sense, especially today. But what are the problems? What are the criticisms people raise?
Oh, there's some pretty significant ones. A classic criticism is that it can seem, self-contradictory.
Right.
Think about the statement, all truth is relative. People ask, well, is that statement itself meant to be an absolutely true statement about truth? It gets a bit tangled logically.
Ah, I see. Like it's making an absolute claim about relativity.
Kind of, yeah. Another worry is, if everything's relative, does that mean we can't say anything is truly wrong? Could, harmful beliefs be considered true just because a certain group holds them? It makes it really tough to resolve disagreements or correct errors because truth isn't stable.
So you lose the concept of mistake.
It gets blurry, definitely. If relativism says lots of ways of knowing are equally valid, it doesn't really give us a reason to prefer, say, science over wishful thinking, even if one clearly works better for finding out facts. And you hear relativistic talk a lot, right? Well, that's just your truth. Often it's just to avoid conflict, but it can seriously get in the way if you're actually trying to figure out what's real.
So the takeaway with relativism is maybe.
Yeah.
Be careful if your main reason for a belief is just, it's true for me.
Yeah, and really question if that holds up against, conflicting evidence or maybe real-world harm.
Okay, so that's relativism, truth varies. Now let's pivot to reliabilism. This sounds like it's all about trust, right? How trustworthy our methods are.
Exactly, you nailed it. Reliabilism is the idea that a belief is justified, it deserves to be called knowledge, if it was produced by a process that generally tends to get things right. A reliable process.
But not just about the reasons you have now.
Not just that. It's about the whole track record of the method you used to get there in the first place. Was it a good method for finding truth?
Okay, can you give me some examples, like reliable versus unreliable?
Sure. So, reliable processes. Think about forming a belief based on clearly seeing something yourself in good light. Things like pure guesswork, wishful thinking, consulting your horoscope. Those methods don't have a great track record for hitting the truth. So the core idea, sometimes called process reliabilism, is basically if you believe something and that something is actually true and you got there via a reliable method, then your belief is justified.
What are the main selling points of this view? Why is it attractive?
Well, reliabilism keeps the focus right on truth. It directly links being justified to how likely your method is to actually get you to the truth. It's practical.
Practical how?
It cares more about whether the method generally works than whether you can perfectly explain every single step. It lines up with how we often operate, right? We trust eyewitnesses or scientific studies because those methods tend to be reliable.
Yeah, that makes intuitive sense.
Plus, it can explain knowledge in cases where someone can't give a detailed explanation. Like maybe a young child knows their parent's face or an animal knows where food is. They're using reliable sensory input even if they can't articulate it.
Ah, okay. So it covers intuition or instinct sometimes.
If that intuition or instinct is based on a process that's proven reliable, yes. Its strength is aligning with that common sense idea. Good knowledge comes from good methods.
But what are the counter-arguments? What are the criticisms leveled against reliabilism?
Right, there are some tricky ones. One is maybe just being reliable isn't always enough for justification.
What do you mean?
Well, philosophers love thought experiments. Imagine someone, let's call her clairvoyant Claire, who has a genuinely reliable clairvoyant power. She forms true beliefs using it, but she has no idea her power is reliable. It just sort of happens.
Okay.
Would we say her beliefs are truly justified knowledge? Many people hesitate. It feels like something's missing, maybe some awareness.
Right, she's just lucky in a way.
Sort of.
Huh.
Another angle is reliability always necessary? Think about the classic brain in a vat scenario or someone in the Matrix.
Okay.
They might use perfectly logical reasoning, normally a reliable process, but all their conclusions are false because their starting point, their whole reality, is fake.
But the reasoning itself is sound.
Exactly. We might still say their reasoning was rational, even though the process wasn't truth conducive in that specific weird situation. So maybe reliability isn't strictly necessary for rationality.
Interesting puzzle. Any other issues?
There's a big one called the generality problem. It sounds technical, but it's basically about how do you define the specific process that led to the belief?
Like, how zoomed in do you get?
Precisely. If you see a bird, was the process vision, or vision in foggy conditions, or vision by someone who needs glasses? The reliability changes depending on how generally or specifically you describe the process. Reliabilism doesn't always give clear instructions on that.
I can see how that would be tricky.
And finally, some argue it might undervalue understanding. By focusing only on whether the process works, you might miss the importance of someone actually grasping why something is true. You could be right via a reliable method, but have zero insight.
Okay, so reliabilism focuses on the trustworthiness of the process. Now let's hit the third one, absolutism. This sounds like the complete flip side of relativism.
You got it. It really is. Absolutism, philosophically speaking, is the view that there are objective, fixed truths, or standards, and they apply everywhere, always, no matter who you are or what your perspective is.
Okay, so truth with a capital T.
Pretty much. When we talk about knowledge, epistemic absolutism means there are definitely correct standards for what counts as true or justified or real knowledge. And those standards hold for everyone. It's the direct counterpoint to relativism.
So give me some examples an absolutist would point to.
Well, the classic ones are things like basic math, 2 + 2 = 4, or scientific facts generally accepted as true, like the Earth orbits the sun.
Things that just are, regardless of opinion.
Exactly. The core idea is that truth is stable, it's mind independent, it doesn't change based on who's looking at it.
What's the main appeal of this view? What are its strengths?
Well, the big one is that it gives us a foundation for, well, reality itself. It says there is a stable truth out there.
Which means
We can actually say some beliefs are right and others are wrong. Objectively. That's fundamental for having things like scientific knowledge or universal facts. It allows for common ground, too.
how so?
If we both believe there's a real answer out there, even if we disagree now, we have a shared goal. Find that answer. We can use evidence and reason, hopefully, to get closer to it together.
Right, it gives you something to aim for.
Exactly. And it avoids those logical knots relativism can get into. If truth isn't infinitely flexible, then saying someone is mistaken actually means something. This belief in objective truth is often what motivates the search for knowledge in the first place.
Like, why bother looking if there's no there?
Right. And practically, absolutism helps uphold standards. Like the idea that good evidence and solid logic are always needed for strong beliefs, that's a kind of absolutist standard. And as we'll see, this belief in objective truth is pretty important for how street epistemology works.
Okay, but it can't be all upsides. What are the criticisms of absolutism?
Definitely not all upsides. A major concern is that it can easily slide into dogmatism. Or being overly certain when you shouldn't be.
Like thinking you have the capital T truth.
Exactly. Believing objective truth exists is one thing. Claiming you know it with 100% certainty, especially on really complex stuff, that's where the problems start. Critics worry it makes people closed-minded, unwilling to listen or change.
Intellectual arrogance, maybe?
That's a good way to put it. Another point is, even if absolute truths do exist, our ability as humans to perfectly grasp them is, well, limited. We make mistakes.
We're fallible.
Totally. So if these absolute truths are ultimately beyond our reach, how useful is absolutism in practice? Relativists also jump in here and say, look, asserting absolute standards is fine, but can you justify why those standards are the right ones without just going in circles?
The justification problem again.
Yeah. And in everyday life, strict absolutism can just feel rigid, insensitive to nuance or context. Think about absolute moral rules applied inflexibly. And focusing only on the absolute truth might make you overlook why someone holds a different belief, the personal reasons or experiences behind it.
So the risk is inflexibility and maybe dismissing people's actual reasons too quickly.
That's a key tension. The challenge isn't necessarily objective truth itself, but the human tendency towards overconfidence and rigidity that can come with believing in it too strongly.
Subscribing is the only way to keep the cows from learning TikTok dances? Like, oh my God.
The stakes have been raised.
I know, it's like we have to save the world.
Yeah, we have to protect the internet.
From dancing cows.
From dancing cows.
Okay, so we've laid out these three big ideas: relativism, reliabilism, absolutism. Now the crucial part, how do these actually connect with doing street epistemology?
Right, this is where the rubber meets the road, philosophically speaking. How does this stuff actually inform those conversations about belief? Street epistemology, remember, is basically a method. It's a specific way of having a conversation.
That one-on-one Socratic questioning thing.
Exactly. And the main goal isn't really to debate what someone believes, but to explore why they believe it, and importantly, how sure they feel about it being true.
So the focus is squarely on their reasoning process and how reliable they think it is.
Precisely. And the core principles of SE really flow from that. First, promoting reflection. Asking things like, how did you arrive at that conclusion? Or what sort of evidence supports that for you?
Getting them to look inward at their own process.
Yeah. Second, encouraging openness and humility. The person doing SE is meant to be a curious listener, not a teacher with an agenda. The aim is understanding, mutual understanding, grounded in fallibilism, the idea that anyone, ourselves included, might be wrong.
That humility piece seems vital.
It is. Third, ethical dialogue. It has to be respectful, non-aggressive, non-coercive, collaborative, not a fight, treating the person as the expert on their own belief.
Okay.
Fourth, there's this underlying focus on, well, truth and reliability. While the SE person doesn't usually state their own position, the whole process kind of assumes that beliefs aligning with reality are better, more useful.
So there's an implicit value placed on truth.
I think so, yes. The concern often arises when people hold beliefs very strongly, especially important ones, based on methods that aren't generally seen as reliable. Things like pure faith or just accepting dogma without questions.
You mentioned virus of the mind idea earlier, comparing faith to something that spreads without scrutiny.
That's right. It's a controversial analogy, but it highlights the worry that some belief systems can persist and spread widely, even if they don't reliably track truth. So SE doesn't tell people what's true, but it operates on the assumption that finding true, well-justified beliefs is generally a good goal.
Which is why they ask about evidence and consistency.
Exactly. Questions about evidence, about internal consistency, about what would cause them to doubt the belief. They all point towards evaluating the belief against reality. Another key principle. The SE practitioner doesn't impose their own beliefs.
Why is that so important?
It massively lowers defensiveness. It allows the other person space to examine their own thinking without feeling attacked. It's like guided metacognition, thinking about your own thinking. And SE often uses tools like analogies or counterexamples, gently probing questions, like the outsider test for faith.
Right, asking someone to think about how they view another religion's faith claims using the same standard they use for their own.
Exactly. It introduces doubt about methods that support wildly different, contradictory conclusions. And finally, there's the confidence calibration.
The 0 to 100 scale.
Yep. Asking someone to rate their certainty, it's not about getting them to 0 necessarily, but prompting reflection, moving them away from unexamined 100% certainty if it's not really justified by their reasons or methods.
Okay, so given all those principles and goals of SE, which of our three Sisms seems like the best fit? Where's the strongest alignment?
Well, look, SE as a practice isn't officially tied to any one philosophy, right? But if you look at its core concerns and methods, it resonates most strongly with Reliabilism.
Reliabilism. Why that one specifically?
Because street epistemology is fundamentally about how people arrive at beliefs. Are the methods they're using reliable guides to truth? That central SE question, how did you conclude this is true, is pure reliabilism in action.
It's focusing on the process.
Exactly. It pushes people to think. Was the way I formed this belief likely to lead me to an accurate understanding? Is relying only on feelings or tradition or maybe an old book as dependable as looking at evidence or using logic? It's all about reflecting on the truth conduciveness of our methods.
So when SE highlights inconsistencies, like how faith leads different people to opposite conclusions.
Right. The underlying point aligns perfectly with reliabilism. Methods like pure faith aren't consistently reliable for finding objective truth because they produce contradictory results with equal conviction. By comparing different belief-forming processes, SE is essentially operationalizing reliabilism in conversation.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about relativism then? How does SE interact with that?
This is where things get a bit trickier. On the face of it, SE's focus on investigating truth seems to clash pretty directly with strong relativism, and often it does.
Yeah, so?
Well, SE practitioners often find that if someone strongly holds the view, hey, what's true for me is true for me, end of story, it makes it really hard to have a productive chat about the reasons or the reliability of their methods.
Because they can just dismiss any challenge as your truth.
Pretty much. The whole SE approach kind of operates on the working assumption that, at least for the topic at hand, there is some kind of objective reality we're trying to understand.
Like if you're discussing whether a specific diet works.
Right. SE assumes it either does or doesn't have certain effects in reality, regardless of what someone feels is true for them. People like Anthony Magnabosco, a well-known SE practitioner, often stress the importance of gently clarifying this early on, asking, do you see truth here as objective, something we can discover, or purely subjective?
And if they say subjective,
it can stall the conversation because questions about evidence or consistency might just get deflected with, well, it works for me, or that's just how I see it. So while relativism stresses respecting different viewpoints, SE ultimately wants to evaluate if a belief actually matches up with the world outside our heads.
So SE has to sort of gently push back against that strong, true for me stance to make progress.
In a very careful, exploratory way, yes. It often involves asking questions designed to get the person thinking about the nature of truth itself. Like, can two contradictory claims both be true in reality? Or is it more likely one is right and one is wrong?
Trying to find common ground on the idea of objective reality.
Exactly. SE generally rejects pure epistemic relativism, the idea that all ways of knowing are equally valid for discovering truth. It tries to move towards acknowledging that if belief A contradicts belief B, they can't both accurately reflect reality.
But it still respects the person's perspective.
Absolutely. It tries to understand why a belief feels true to someone within their context, but the underlying goal is exploring what's actually true, not just subjectively true. So it acknowledges context matters, learning from relativism is insight, but evaluates beliefs against a shared reality. Strong relativism is often seen as an obstacle to that kind of genuine inquiry.
Okay. Now, what about absolutism? How does that fit with street epistemology?
The relationship here is interesting, nuanced. On one hand, SE is definitely built on a foundation that leans towards absolutism, in a sense.
In what sense?
In the sense that it assumes an objective reality exists. There are facts of the matter. If that wasn't the case, the whole project of trying to figure out if beliefs are true or false wouldn't really make sense, would it?
That would be pointless.
Right. SE implicitly assumes some beliefs are better representations of reality than others. That aligns with a basic absolutist idea. Experienced practitioners often talk about the importance of this shared understanding. Truth is objective, it's the same for everyone, even if we disagree about what it is.
So SE needs a dose of absolutism to function, like moderate absolutism or objectivism.
I think that's fair to say. The idea that facts exist and believing true things is the goal. However, and this is crucial, SE is strongly opposed to dogmatic or arrogant absolutism.
I know the absolute truth and you're wrong kind.
Exactly that. SE actively challenges unwarranted certainty. Claiming 100% confidence without rock-solid, examined reasons is something SE conversations often gently push back on. The ideal SE promotes is more like fallibilist absolutism.
Fallibilist absolutism. What's that?
It's believing that objective truth exists and acknowledging that we humans are fallible. We could be wrong about what we currently think is true. So we should always be open to revising our beliefs based on new evidence or better reasoning.
So truth exists, but we might not have a perfect grip on it.
Precisely. SE doesn't have the practitioner declare the right answer. Instead, it facilitates a process where the other person can discover potential problems or inconsistencies in their own reasoning. So it uses objective truth as a guiding principle, but enforces humility and openness, pushing against that dogmatic certainty.
Okay, that clarifies the theoretical links. Now let's make it really practical. How do these three stances actually look and feel during an SE conversation? How do they influence the interaction?
Great question. Let's think about the core goals. Promoting truth, for instance.
Right.
How does each stance help or hinder that? Relativism, as we said, can be a real obstacle if it leads to, well, that's just my truth, effectively ending the search for objective reality.
Stops the inquiry.
Yeah. Reliabilism, though, directly serves the goal of promoting truth by focusing the conversation on whether the methods used actually lead to truth. It keeps the discussion grounded in truth conduciveness.
And absolutism.
Absolutism provides the underlying why. Why bother searching for truth? Because it exists objectively. That affirmation motivates the whole process. Without assuming some objective reality, evaluating beliefs doesn't have much point.
Sign up for our free course at navigatingbeliefs.com. Unlock the tools to rethink, reflect, and grow.
I like the word unlock. It's like there's this potential within you, but you need the right key.
Right, it's like a treasure chest or something.
Exactly.
Okay, what about evaluating the reliability of beliefs or methods? How does each stance approach that?
Well, from a relativistic viewpoint, what even counts as reliable might be seen as context-dependent. Maybe faith is reliable in one framework, evidence in another. It makes comparing methods difficult.
It doesn't give you a universal yardstick.
Exactly. Reliabilism obviously puts reliability smack bang in the center. The entire focus is, does this process reliably get things right? It is the yardstick.
And absolutism's view on reliability.
Absolutism would tend to argue for universal standards of reliability, things like logic, evidence, checking sources. These aren't just relatively reliable, they are objectively better ways to get to the truth, full stop.
Okay. Now, impact on the ethics of the conversation. Building rapport, respect.
This is important. Relativism's non-judgmental stance, all views valid in context, can be great for initial rapport, makes people feel heard. But the risk, again, is maybe becoming too permissive, not challenging potentially harmful ideas because it's their truth.
A fine line.
It is. Reliabilism can actually be quite respectful ethically because you're focusing critique on the method, not the person. How reliable is that way of thinking, rather than why are you believing that? But of course, how you ask is critical.
Tone matters. A lot.
Immensely. And absolutism, well, if it comes across as arrogant certainty, I'm right, you're wrong, it's obviously terrible for ethical dialogue, kills rapport instantly. But if it's framed as a shared commitment to finding objective reality, assuming both parties are humble and genuinely seeking truths, it can actually strengthen the ethical bond by preventing relativistic escape hatches and keeping the focus on shared discovery.
So humble absolutism, good. Arrogant absolutism, bad for dialogue?
Pretty much. And finally, how do they affect openness to reflection?
Right. Does the stance make someone more or less likely to actually examine their own beliefs?
Relativism might ironically reduce the motivation for deep reflection. If my truth is just as good as yours, why bother digging too deep or questioning myself?
Complacency, perhaps?
Could be. Reliabilism, by its nature, promotes reflection. It's constantly asking, how did I get here? Was that a good way? It's inherently metacognitive.
And absolutism's effect on reflection.
It's a double-edged sword. Arrogant absolutism, I know the truth, shuts down reflection completely. But that fallibilist absolutism we talked about, believing truth exists but knowing I might be wrong, that can be a powerful motivator for reflection. It encourages careful self-scrutiny against that ideal standard of truth.
So SE tries to cultivate that second kind, belief in truth, plus awareness of fallibility.
Exactly. Gently challenging the unwarranted 100% certainty is key to fostering that reflective space.
This really paints a clear picture of the philosophical undercurrents. Okay, so pulling all this together, based on these strengths and weaknesses, what are some concrete, actionable ways to maybe tweak or strengthen the practice of SE?
Yeah, thinking about how to leverage the best of these ideas, we can definitely identify some potential enhancements. First, maybe explicitly address potential relativism early on, like a truth calibration chat.
Truth calibration, how would that work?
Just gently exploring their view on truth at the start. Is it objective or subjective for this topic? Using simple analogies like, If two medicines give opposite results, can they both be truly effective? The goal is just to try and get on the same page about aiming for shared reality, respectfully challenging that true for me reflex if it comes up, as Magna Bosco suggests.
Okay, establish common ground on reality. What else?
Second, really lean into that shared goal aspect, leveraging moderate absolutism. Frame it explicitly. We're both trying to figure out what's true here, or we both want to believe true things and avoid false ones, right? Acknowledge your own fallibility, too. That builds trust and collaboration.
Makes it less adversarial.
Exactly. Third, enhance the reliabilist part. Maybe incorporate more explicit reliability checks. You could even use a scale. On a scale of 1 to 10, how reliable do you think that source or that method is?
And then discuss why they gave that rating.
Yeah. Discuss error rates. How would you know if this method was misleading you? Maybe even quickly list pros and cons for a method's reliability together. Makes it more concrete.
I like that. What about countering the negative side of absolutism, the dogmatism?
Good point. Fourth, actively use multiple perspectives. Ask them to explain the other side. How might someone reasonably arrive at the opposite conclusion and feel just as sure? That's the outsider test idea again.
Encourages empathy and perspective taking.
Right. And consistently encourage thinking in degrees of confidence, not just 0% or 100%. And the practitioner should model this. Mention times you were wrong or changed your mind. Show, don't just tell, intellectual humility.
Okay, so calibrate truth, emphasize collaboration, check reliability, use multiple perspectives. Anything else?
2 more quick ones. Fifth, really learn from relativism's insight about context. Take time to understand why the belief matters to them personally. Ask about their background, show empathy for their story.
Acknowledge the personal dimension.
Yes, while still gently exploring things like confirmation bias. You can frame the whole conversation around the practical impact of the belief being true or false in their life. Maybe even frame examining the belief as a way to strengthen their confidence if it holds up.
Okay, and the last one.
Sixth, encourage ongoing self-reflection after the chat. S shouldn't be a one-off intervention. Suggest tools like a belief journal, playing devil's advocate with their own ideas, learning about critical thinking or biases. Maybe suggest trying out different news sources.
Position SE as a starting point for ongoing epistemic health.
Exactly. A journey of self-improvement in how we think and know.
These are fantastic, practical suggestions.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned context and framing a few times. Can we dig into that a bit more? How does the immediate setting, the way you frame the talk, shape this reality people are exploring?
Absolutely critical. Context is everything, really. There's the immediate physical context. Are you talking in a noisy street, a quiet cafe? That affects openness. Then there's the personal context, histories, traumas, values, and the societal context, cultural norms, shared assumptions.
And relativism highlights how these shape what seems real or justified.
Precisely. What counts as good evidence in a scientific lab might be different from what counts in a spiritual community. When an SE conversation crosses these boundaries, the practitioner needs to be super aware of the different frameworks.
You need to translate, almost, or find common ground.
Yeah, you need to try and establish a shared context for the conversation, or at least acknowledge the different contexts respectfully. And the framing of the conversation itself is huge.
How so?
If you frame it as a collaborative inquiry, a joint exploration, you're naturally encouraging more of that reliabilist and fallibilist, absolutist mindset. If it feels like a debate or an attack.
People get defensive, retreat into relativism, my truth, or dig into dogmatic absolutism, I'm right.
Exactly. That's why the SE emphasis on curiosity, listening, and shared goals is so important for framing. Even the type of questions open-ended versus leading shapes the frame dramatically.
You also mentioned reality negotiation. What's that about? Sounds intriguing.
It's this subtle ongoing process in the conversation about what counts as relevant to determining reality. Someone might bring in purely subjective feelings or untestable claims leaning on a relativistic frame.
And the SE practitioner's role
is to navigate that gently. Maybe ask, okay, I hear that feeling is strong for you. How could we check if that feeling corresponds to something happening in the outside world? Using reliabilism to find common ground on accepted methods. What ways do we both agree are good for finding out facts? And using that moderate absolutism framing, let's try to discover the reality together.
So it's about guiding the negotiation towards shared, reliable methods without dismissing the person's experience.
That's the tightrope walk. And you have to be aware of the emotional framing, too, especially for identity-linked beliefs. Is changing your mind framed as failure or as intellectual courage, that makes a huge difference.
It really sounds like a skilled practitioner needs to be sensitive to all these layers: philosophical stances, context, emotion, framing.
Absolutely. They're drawing on relativism's sensitivity to context and perspective, reliabilism's focus on rigorous methods, and moderate absolutism's commitment to objective truth, all while maintaining ethical dialogue and fostering reflection. It's a complex balancing act.
Wow. This has been an incredibly illuminating deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the core philosophies to practical applications in SE. So you had to boil it down. What's the single most important takeaway for someone listening?
I think the key takeaway is really about balance. The most effective, most ethical approach to exploring beliefs, whether in street epistemology or just in our own lives, probably involves drawing the best from all these perspectives. We need relativism's sensitivity to different viewpoints and contexts, we need reliabilism's rigorous focus on trustworthy methods, and we need moderate absolutism's clarity that there is a reality to strive for.
So it's not about picking one epistemism and sticking to it rigidly.
Not at all. It's about integrating their strengths, creating an environment in conversation or just in our own heads that is respectful, humble, but also genuinely committed to figuring out what's true. And those practical tweaks we discussed, they're all aimed at fostering that balanced, truth-seeking, yet respectful approach.
Some really profound ideas to sit with there. And maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Think about the different realities you navigate every single day. Your deeply held personal beliefs, the assumptions in your social groups, the fire hose of information you consume. How do the methods you use to decide what's true in each of those bubbles stack up against the ideas we've explored today? Reliability, context, objectivity. And maybe, what might you discover if you turned a more critical, yet still curious lens onto those very processes you use to build your own reality?
That's a powerful question to end on. Food for thought for all of us.
Indeed. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. It's been fascinating.
My pleasure. Always great to explore these ideas.
Until our next exploration.